In 1883, a small American town was shaken by an event so strange and inexplicable that many historians still try to erase the records. When residents began to disappear, no one could have imagined that the mystery that would unfold would challenge everything they knew about reality. What do you think might have caused the mysterious disappearances? Which theory do you find most plausible? Something supernatural or a human conspiracy? In 1883, the town of Ashford, in the American Midwest, was a quiet, rural community where the inhabitants lived simple lives without major disturbances. However, something unusual began to happen that year. The first signs that something was wrong came on a cold November morning when Samuel McAllister's wife, Mrs. Beatrice, disappeared without a trace. Samuel, a tall man with a rigid posture, had woken up early, as he always did, to feed the farm animals. Beatrice never slept late, and the fact that she hadn't appeared for breakfast was the first indication that something was amiss. Despair gripped her husband, who searched the entire house and, not finding her, launched a search into the surrounding area. He immediately called upon the townspeople for help. For 3 days, they scoured every corner of the forest and the town, but found no sign of Beatrice. Local authorities initially believed she might have run away. Perhaps she had felt suffocated by the simple life in Ashford. But Samuel, devastated by the loss and the idea that his wife would never leave without giving him an explanation, insisted there was more, something dark, something he couldn't understand. On the day Beatrice disappeared, something peculiar happened. A dense fog covered the city. Those who ventured into the forest claimed the air felt heavier than usual, as if they were being watched, as if nature itself had rebelled. Samuel, however, was more focused on finding his wife than on any supernatural explanation. He went to the local sheriff, Tom Willis, a man of firm character, but with a sense of justice that often led him to disregard any inexplicable event. When Willis was informed of the disappearance, he initially thought it was just a case of someone who had decided to leave, like so many others in the West, where people often got lost in the vastness of nature. But the description of the fog and reports that the town's dogs were unable to sniff out any clues convinced him to investigate further. Days passed, and the town of Ashford was gripped by a growing sense of uncertainty. Samuel's despair grew, but he was determined to find his wife, even if it meant confronting forces he didn't understand. He began hearing stories from other residents who had also noticed strange things in recent weeks. Some claimed to hear whispers at night, while others, like young Tom, swore they had seen shadows moving at the edge of the forest, things they couldn't explain. Amidst all this, Samuel began to suspect something even more sinister. Beatrice's disappearance was no isolated incident. He discovered that, in recent years, other people had disappeared from the city. Most of the time, the cases had been dismissed by local authorities as runaways or deaths in the wild, but Samuel believed there was something deeper, something the residents were trying to hide. The city was immersed in an atmosphere of growing paranoia. Samuel, with his determination, had become an outcast, distrusted by many, seen as someone who was bringing trouble to the peaceful city. But he didn't care what they thought of him. He knew there was something more, something they couldn't ignore. At the end of that week, the fog returned, denser than ever, and with it more disappearances. This time the victims were people with closer ties to Ashford's history: the mayor, Andrew Clark, and the local pharmacist, Jonathan Wilkes. They vanished overnight, leaving no trace except for a strange cross-shaped burn mark on the ground where their bodies should have been. Sheriff Willis, now having gained Samuel's trust, began to question the rationality of the explanations he himself had previously given. The Beatrice McAllister case was no simple one. Something was happening in Ashford, something the town's historians were trying to hide, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of convenience. But Samuel knew that if he didn't uncover the truth, no one else would. Meanwhile, a new character began to appear in the shadows of the city. A strange outsider named Elias Hartley arrived in town in a dark carriage, with an enigmatic look and a smile that didn't seem sincere. Hartley offered to help in the search for Beatrice, but his presence only increased Samuel's distrust. Who was Elias Hartley? And what did he know about the disappearances? More importantly, was he helping or was he somehow involved in the Ashford mysteries? The truth was closer than Samuel imagined, but it was shrouded in a web of secrets that few were willing to unravel. And as the fog enveloped the city, the growing fear seemed to promise that Ashford would never be the same again. What do you think is happening in Ashford? Are the disappearances the work of supernatural forces, or is there something darker behind it? As the days passed, the city of Ashford began to shut down. Growing fear shaped every interaction, and the normally vibrant streets were now deserted, with house windows closed and few people daring to venture out at night. Conversations, once so common, became whispered, almost as if words had the power to summon what no one wanted to face. The truth about the disappearances. Samuel McAllister had become a solitary figure. His days were dedicated to the relentless search for answers, while his efforts to find his wife began to wear down his own mental health. He was exhausted, with deep, dark circles under his eyes, but this did not stop him from continuing to dig deeper into the city's secrets. In his mind, the mystery was no longer about his wife. It was about what was happening in Ashford, something that involved the city's oldest roots. Over the years, many had forgotten the stories that the elders told about Ashford. The birth of the city, the first settlers, and how during the 19th century the city had been the scene of various disputes over land and resources. The tension between the residents and the indigenous peoples who inhabited those lands before the arrival of the settlers had never been fully resolved, and many came to believe that the old native legends, passed down from generation to generation, had some basis in reality. Samuel, though skeptical, began to question whether these stories might have any truth to them. He spoke with old Jameson Cooper, an Ashford resident since childhood, and one of the few who still remembered the old legends. Jameson spoke cautiously, in a low voice, as if afraid of being overheard. He told Samuel that before the town was founded, the native peoples believed the land around Ashford was cursed. "There's something in the ground," Jameson was saying, "something that shouldn't be disturbed, something that was awakened when men began to build here." According to Jameson, there was a legend about an ancient ritual practiced by the indigenous people that involved the sacrifice of souls to ensure that the land remained fertile and prosperous. But what happened when the colonists arrived, according to Jameson, was that they disregarded the rituals and buried the land with the bodies of the dead without considering the consequences. Samuel, though skeptical, couldn't deny that current events seemed to coincide with these ancient stories. The disappearance of Beatrice and the others couldn't be explained by mere normal circumstances. Something else was at play, something that went back to those ancient beliefs. Meanwhile, Elias Hartley, the enigmatic outsider, continued to offer his help. Although his presence was no longer welcome by many of the residents, his increasingly strange behavior generated distrust. But Samuel couldn't ignore that Elias seemed to have some kind of knowledge about what was happening. And he was willing to share that information, but only when Samuel was ready to hear it. Elias revealed to Samuel on a cold night that there was an ancient secret society formed by influential residents of Ashford that kept the secret about the disappearances. According to Elias, this society had existed since the city's earliest days and was involved in secret rituals, seeking ways to control the land and ensure the city's prosperity. "What you don't know, Samuel," Elias said in a serious tone, "is that the city has a debt to something beyond this world, and that debt is being collected." What Elias didn't tell Samuel, however, was that he himself had a direct connection to the secret society. He was a descendant of one of Ashford's early founders, a man whose name was associated with many of the city's unsolved mysteries. But this revelation would come later, when Samuel was already immersed in the secrets and shadows of Ashford. However, as more disappearances occurred, the pressure on the city increased. Samuel knew that the key to understanding what was happening lay in Ashford's past. He needed to discover what had really happened at the city's founding, what the ancient legends were trying to warn against. The city, once seen as a haven of peace and tranquility, was now becoming a place where its inhabitants found themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Time was against Samuel. What he discovered now would not only save Beatrice's life, but could also unravel the fate of the entire city. Do you think the native legends of Ashford have any basis in reality? What do you think the secret society is trying to protect? The wind cut through the streets of Ashford like a knife, bringing with it the omen of another difficult night. Samuel McAllister, now more determined than ever, knew that his search for answers was only beginning. He could no longer ignore the truth that seemed to slip through his fingers with every step. Something of greater magnitude was happening in his city, something he couldn't fully understand, but which terrified him more and more. In recent days, the disappearances had intensified. Each new victim seemed more important than the last. First it was ordinary villagers, then the mayor and the pharmacist, and now the disappearances were affecting key figures in the town, such as Reverend John Thomas, who led the small church in Ashford. The town was slowly disintegrating, like an old building that could no longer bear the weight of the secrets buried in its soil. Samuel sought out Elias Hartley, who seemed to know more than he was willing to reveal. With each meeting, Elias seemed to have more answers, but also raised more questions. He went straight to the point this time, revealing that the secret society of Ashford wasn't just seeking power, but trying to uphold a pact far older than they imagined. It was a matter of survival, and the land, as he had said, was collecting its debt. Samuel, you don't understand the gravity of this. The city was built on something that shouldn't have been touched. Those rituals the ancients practiced, they weren't just trying to control the land, they were trying to prevent something far worse from happening, Elias said gravely, his eyes welling with the weight of the revelation. But what is this something worse? Samuel asked, almost in despair. Elias hesitated before answering, as if weighing his words carefully. The earth is hungry. What was buried down there should never have been unearthed. And the disappearances, they're all connected to this. With each soul lost, the earth grows stronger, hungrier. The mystery unfolding now had a complexity that Samuel could not have imagined. The land, the pact, the disappearances, everything seemed to be intertwined in a web of secrets, as old as the city itself. With each answer Elijah gave, more questions arose, and the fear intensified. Meanwhile, Sheriff Tom Willis, who had initially been skeptical about the idea that something supernatural was happening, began to change his perspective. He knew Samuel was close to discovering something important, but he also knew that if they continued down this path, they might be digging their own grave. "Samuel, you need to stop this," said the sheriff, more worried than anything else. "These disappearances, these stories, they're not going to lead to anything good. You're messing with forces you don't understand." But Samuel was beyond warning. He knew he couldn't stop now. His wife, Beatrice, was still somewhere, and he needed to find her before it was too late. Elijah's words echoed in his mind. "The land is hungry." It was as if every step he took, every person he met, was being swallowed by an invisible force, a shadow hanging over Ashford. During his search, Samuel discovered a clue that could change everything. He found an old diary hidden among the shelves in a city library. The diary belonged to Jonathan Wilkes, the missing pharmacist, and contained notes on ancient rituals, as well as references to strange symbols and ceremonies dating back to the first settlers. But what caught Samuel's attention was a torn page with a single handwritten sentence. "When the last soul is taken, the earth will be free." The meaning of those words left him paralyzed. What did liberated mean? And who or what needed to be liberated? These questions hammered in his head as he ran to find Elias and get more answers. However, the town was already changing. The remaining residents seemed to withdraw more into their homes, avoiding interaction with one another. Those whom Samuel tried to question no longer had the courage to speak. Something was frightening them so much that they preferred to ignore the disappearances rather than risk becoming the next victims. Ashford had become a place of silence, where the truth was something to be feared. Elijah, for his part, was becoming increasingly evasive. He spoke in a way that seemed no longer concerned with the consequences. His mysterious behavior and disconcerting attitude made him an increasingly enigmatic figure. Samuel began to wonder if Elijah was trying to protect the city from some kind of cataclysm, or if he himself was somehow involved in what was happening. At that moment, Samuel knew he had to act fast. The last soul had not yet been taken. If he didn't find the key to stop what was about to happen, Ashford could be destroyed forever. What do you think the phrase in Jonathan Wilkes's diary means? When the last soul is taken, the land will be freed. Do you believe the city of Ashford is truly in danger of being destroyed? The pressure in Ashford was more palpable than ever. As Samuel McAllister investigated the mystery behind the disappearances and ancient rituals, the atmosphere in the town grew increasingly heavy. The few residents who still ventured into the streets spoke in whispers, as if any wrong word could summon something dark. And indeed, the shadows seemed to move more frequently. Samuel had begun to suspect that there was something more, something within the city that was deteriorating beyond the disappearances. Relationships among the Ashfordians were fragmenting. The city, once united by the struggle for survival, now seemed to be on the verge of total collapse. Fear was eroding trust between people, and some began to view others with suspicion. Anyone could be the next to disappear. Meanwhile, Sheriff Tom Willis tried to maintain order, but his authority was being challenged daily. Growing fear led the residents to take drastic measures. Many began arming themselves, not to confront a physical enemy, but to protect themselves from something invisible, something they couldn't control. Tom Willis, though skeptical of supernatural explanations, knew something was deeply wrong. He could no longer deny what was happening. But at the same time, he felt powerless in the face of what was unfolding in the town. There was also young Abigail Hayes, daughter of Reverend John Thomas, one of the last victims of the disappearances. Abigail, a 20-year-old woman, was known for her unwavering faith, but upon losing her father, she was overcome by a silent despair. She began to question everything she had been taught, everything she believed to be true. The pain of losing someone so close was transformed into a search for answers. Abigail, unlike Samuel, was unwilling to follow the dark path he had begun to tread. She sought comfort in the old stories of her childhood, in the legends and myths she had heard in her church, and went to the mountains north of the city in search of some clue, something that could explain the events that were shaking Ashford. But upon arriving there, she discovered something that would change her life forever. An ancient Native American altar, covered in symbols she never imagined seeing in her own city. Abigail's discovery was no coincidence. She was being drawn to something, as if guided by forces beyond her comprehension. However, she didn't know that by entering the altar, she had taken a step closer to uncovering the secret Ashford was trying to hide. And in doing so, she had also become a key piece in the outcome that was to come. While Abigail was trying to understand what she had found, Samuel was on the verge of a new understanding. The notes he had found in Jonathan Wilkes's journal had led him to a new clue. He discovered that the symbols in the journal corresponded to ancient markings on stones near the forest. The stones, according to information from Elias Hartley, were from a time before the founding of Ashford, and no one had ever dared to study them closely, fearing that what lay beneath them was worse than anything they had ever faced. Samuel knew he needed to find those stones, but he also sensed the growing tension in Ashford. The city was no longer just a place he called home. Now it was a battlefield, where everyone was trying to escape what seemed to be an inevitable fate. And people were beginning to lose their minds. Elias Hartley, for his part, disappeared for several days, which further increased the suspicion surrounding him. Samuel feared that Elias had become more involved than he imagined. When he finally reappeared, he seemed more worried than ever. His posture was tense, and he insisted that Samuel go to the stones as quickly as possible before it was too late. But before he could explain further, Elias disappeared again, without a trace. The town was reaching a critical point. The residents were increasingly divided. Some believed the only way out was to abandon Ashford, but others were willing to confront whatever was behind the disappearances. The situation was about to escalate into a direct confrontation, and Samuel knew there was no more time to wait. The subplots intertwined, and each revelation seemed to create more questions than answers. Abigail, with her search for answers, Samuel, in his relentless determination to uncover the truth, and Sheriff Willis, trying to maintain order in a town that was falling apart. All were caught in a dangerous dance, with consequences that no one could foresee. But the worst was yet to come. When Samuel finally reached the stones, he discovered an inscription on one of the rocks, which appeared to be a warning. When the last flame is extinguished, the earth will be freed, and the soul of what was buried will be awakened. Now Samuel was closer than ever to discovering what would happen if the last soul were truly taken. And with that, Ashford's fate was about to be sealed. What do you think the last flame going out means? Is Samuel about to find out what will happen when that happens? What will the future of Ashford be? The biting cold of the night enveloped Ashford like a dark cloak, and the city seemed to breathe in unison with the growing fear. Samuel McAllister, now aware that he was approaching something much bigger than he had imagined, could no longer ignore the revelations that emerged at every turn. The clues he had found led him to the ancient stones, where an inscription terrified him. When the last flame is extinguished, the earth will be freed, and the soul of what was buried will be awakened. The words burned in his mind, as if trying to show him the inevitable. Something was about to happen, and Samuel didn't know if he would be able to stop what was coming. That night, he made his way to the center of town, where Sheriff Tom Willis was meeting with some of Ashford's most influential residents. They were discussing the escalating violence in the town and the need to find a solution. But Samuel knew there was no possible solution, not in the way they envisioned. The danger wasn't in the streets, but beneath the town, in the depths of its history. Samuel interrupted the meeting with an urgency that did not go unnoticed. He told everyone that they weren't just dealing with random disappearances. It wasn't a matter of people fleeing or dying in the wild. They were dealing with an ancient force, something that had long been buried beneath Ashford, something that was now about to be unleashed. Reverend Abigail Hayes, still reeling from the loss of her father, was present at the meeting. She had begun to question her faith, but this seemed like a revelation that resonated with fragments of what she already suspected. When Samuel spoke of the liberated land, she stared at him wide-eyed. She knew, instinctively, that Samuel was talking about something that transcended what humanity could comprehend. "Are you saying that what's happening here is divine?" she asked, her voice full of doubt and fear. Samuel took a deep breath. He wanted to believe that it was possible to understand what was happening with a simple explanation, but what he had in his hands didn't make sense. He had no way to prove that the earth was hungry, as Elias Hartley had said. But something inside him knew that Elias's words weren't just metaphors, they weren't just legends. "No, Abigail," he replied in a somber tone. "I don't know what it is, but I know it's related to what was buried here. Something our ancestors, the first settlers of Ashford, tried to control with rituals, And now, as these souls are disappearing, the time is coming to release what has been kept hidden. The city, once divided, now seemed united in fear, but at the same time the truth was becoming increasingly clear. They had no control over the situation. It was too late to escape. The land, with all its buried secrets, was beginning to exact its price. It was at this moment that the truth about Elias Hartley was finally revealed. Initially, Samuel had believed that Elias was merely an outsider with a peculiar interest in Ashford's history, but Elias was not just that. He was, in fact, one of the direct descendants of the city's first generation of settlers. He knew more about Ashford's curse than anyone else, and had infiltrated the city with a single objective: to ensure that the cycle of sacrifices continued. Elijah wasn't helping Samuel. He was manipulating him. "You think you're getting closer to the truth, Samuel, but you're only digging your own grave," Elijah said with a cold smile. "When the last soul is taken, it will be the end of everything. There's no escaping it." Samuel, who until then had trusted Elias, was paralyzed by the revelation. Elias, the man he believed to be his ally, was now his greatest enemy. The secret society to which Elias belonged was not a simple organization of former residents. It was the key to unlocking the power that lay dormant beneath Ashford. Elias continued, now with a tone of disdain. "The land will not only be liberated, it will be renewed. Everything that was destroyed by colonization, all the wrongs committed by the men who desecrated these lands, will be righted. The price, the sacrifice of souls. The last soul will be the one that brings about rebirth." Samuel felt a lump tighten in his throat. He knew what this meant. What was happening in Ashford wasn't just a series of disappearances. It was an ancient, relentless cosmic force about to claim its debt. Fear gripped the city as residents began to realize they had been manipulated from the start. Elias Hartley, as a descendant of one of the founding families, held the power to control the events that were about to unfold. The city was designed to be a point of sacrifice, and now what had been buried for centuries was about to return. Desperate, Samuel knew he needed to act fast. If he couldn't stop Elias and the secret society, what remained of Ashford would be consumed by the earth. But to do that, he would have to make an impossible decision: stop the release of the ancient power or allow Ashford to be destroyed forever. What do you think will happen to Ashford? Will Samuel be able to stop Elijah and the secret society from completing the ritual? And if he fails, what will be released from the earth? The city of Ashford was ablaze, metaphorically, but soon perhaps literally as well. Fear was rampant, and every corner of the city seemed to have become a stage for the final showdown. Samuel McAllister, now aware that Elias Hartley and the secret society were deeply involved in the city's curse, knew the time to act had come. If he failed, Ashford would be destroyed forever, and the land would finally break free, bringing with it something far darker than they could ever imagine. That night, a full moon shone over the city, illuminating the deserted streets. The biting wind seemed to be the sigh of something awaiting the right moment to act. Samuel was in the central square, where the secret society was gathering to complete the final ritual. The altar, an ancient structure hidden beneath the city, was prepared. The marking of ancient symbols on the surrounding stones, the fire burning in the torches, and the soft sound of unintelligible whispers indicated that something enormous was about to happen. Elias Hartley stood there before the altar, with the members of society, all their faces covered by masks, making the final preparations. He seemed in a trance, as if he had already accepted the inevitable. Samuel approached, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he wouldn't have another chance. If he didn't act now, the cycle would be complete, and Ashford's fate would be sealed. "You're too late, Samuel," said Elijah, without turning to look at him. His voice was calm, almost pleasurable. "This is the end of Ashford. This is the rebirth of the land. What was buried will be released, and the city with all its sins will be cleansed. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. The truth was finally before him. It wasn't just a matter of human sacrifices, but of an ancient power that Elijah wanted to unleash. He wasn't just trying to save the city or protect his family. He wanted to control the land, to take possession of an ancient power that would transcend everything that men could comprehend. "You don't understand, Elias," Samuel shouted, his voice thick with despair. "This isn't rebirth, it's destruction. What's buried here must not be released." Elias turned slowly, a cold smile on his face. "There's no time to go back, Samuel. You've already dug your own grave. The last soul will be taken, and the land will be renewed. No one will be able to escape." Hearing those words, Samuel felt a wave of anger and fear, but also clarity. He knew there was no more room for argument. He had to stop the ritual before it was too late. But there was something Elijah hadn't foreseen. The real key to stopping all this lay not in physical combat or words, but in a different kind of sacrifice, a sacrifice of faith. Abigail Hayes, who had approached the hidden spot in the shadows, suddenly appeared. She looked at Samuel, her eyes shining with understanding. She wasn't there to help with brute force or words of resistance. She knew what she needed to do. "Samuel," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "if the land is truly hungry, then we must feed it with something pure. It cannot be a blood sacrifice, but a sacrifice of the soul, something that represents what Ashford has truly lost." Elias laughed, as if he had heard the greatest nonsense. "Do you still believe in any form of redemption? There is no redemption here. Only destruction." Abigail stepped forward without hesitation. She placed her hands on the central stone of the altar, beginning to recite a prayer that Samuel never imagined he would hear in his life. It was an ancient prayer, a prayer that came from the roots of the city, something that had been lost, but which now resonated again with all the power of what Ashford truly was. A city seeking a new beginning, not at the cost of destruction, but through the recovery of its true essence. The moment Abigail finished reciting the prayer, the sky above the city seemed to open. The moon shone brighter, and the stones around the altar began to vibrate. The air grew thicker, and the sound of an unseen force beginning to break free echoed through the city. All the inhabitants of Ashford, even those who had hidden in their homes, felt an overwhelming pressure in their chests. The city was being consumed, but not in a devastating way. It was a transformation. The earth began to stir, as if shifting, adjusting to something new, something profound. Elijah, now pale and utterly terrified, tried to pull away, but the stones around the altar began to rise, trapping him in a circle of power. He screamed, trying to break free, but the forces he had sought to control were beyond his comprehension. The earth would not be his slave, and in trying to manipulate it, he was consumed by it. Samuel, his eyes fixed on the altar, saw the power of Abigail and the prayer she had uttered. She had brought about a change, a force that could not be corrupted. The city was being restored, and the land was no longer famine-stricken. It was, at last, in balance. When everything calmed down, the city of Ashford was unrecognizable, but in a different way. The disappearances had ceased, and the residents, burdened by the now revealed truth, began to rebuild not only their homes, but the very history of the city. The cycle of destruction had been broken, and the land could finally breathe again. How do you think Ashford will rebuild after this upheaval? Has the city finally found peace, or will what happened to the land leave permanent scars? Was Abigail's sacrifice enough to restore balance? The dawn that rose over Ashford was silent, as if the city were taking a deep breath after the chaos. The air seemed lighter, and the land, which had once seemed tormented, now exuded a tranquility unseen in decades. Although fear was still etched on the faces of the residents, there was a sense of renewal, of something deep being healed, both in the people and in the very soil where so many mistakes had been made. Samuel McAllister stood in the central square, gazing at the remains of the altar and the stones that had transformed before his eyes. The city, marked by its bloody history and full of secrets, finally seemed to have found a purpose. The transformation that began with the disappearances now resulted in a city seeking redemption. But at the same time, there was something undeniable. The pain Ashford had endured would not be so easily forgotten. Abigail Hayes, her eyes weary but hopeful, walked beside Samuel. She felt the weight of the sacrifice she had made, not of her own life but of her faith, of her understanding of what truly mattered. Throughout the months of persecution and revelation, she had lost much, but she had also found something she never imagined, a connection to the city and to her own destiny. She had been the key to its restoration, but the price of that key was high. "You did the right thing, Abigail," said Samuel in a soft voice. "What you did saved Ashford, but it also saved us all." She looked at him, smiling slightly, but with a silent sadness in her eyes. "I only did what I thought should be done. There was no other choice. Ashford needed something more than strength or anger. It needed healing, and perhaps that's what was always missing here." The streets of Ashford were emptier than ever. The city, which had once seemed a prosperous and vibrant place, was now in a state of reconstruction. Some houses had been destroyed, but people were beginning to come together to rebuild them, not just physically, but emotionally. Ashford would no longer be what it once was, but it could not be ignored either. There was something powerful in its foundations, in its very core, that now proved stronger than the evil that had been buried beneath it for so long. The city's inhabitants began to grapple with the consequences of their actions, of their choices. Some were forgiven, others, like Elias Hartley, could not be saved. The legacy of manipulation and destruction left by him and his followers was a burden Ashford would have to bear for a long time. But the truth had now been exposed, and this gave new hope for the future. Samuel glanced at Abigail one more time before turning toward the city. "What do you think will happen now?" he asked, hoping for an answer that might somehow close the final chapter of that story. Abigail thought for a moment and replied in a firm voice, "Ashford will continue to grow. It won't be easy, but now at least we can write our own story. Whatever comes next, we can face it together." Silence reigned for a brief moment as they both gazed at the city, which now breathed with a new energy, an energy of survival, healing, and perhaps even forgiveness. The land was finally in balance, and the city, though scarred, now had a chance to begin anew. "What do you think the future holds for Ashford and its inhabitants? Will the city continue to prosper, or will the scars of the past still haunt it? How do you imagine the characters will deal with the consequences of everything that has happened? Years have passed since the events that transformed Ashford. The city, now stronger and more united, rose from the ashes like a phoenix, rebuilding its homes and its lives. Samuel and Abigail, now respected leaders in the community, worked tirelessly to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated. The mystery of the land and the souls that were once under its curse was solved, but traces of what occurred still linger. Ashford would never be the same again, but with time it found a balance that brought peace to those who remained. Now that you've learned the story of Ashford, what's your opinion on the sacrifices made by Samuel and Abigail? Do you believe the city has truly healed, or could the shadows of the past still return? Share your thoughts in the comments below and keep following our stories, as there are always more mysteries waiting to be uncovered.